Hi, so this is for discussion 3. The first story that impacted me from our reading this week was a story about the internist that worked on an AIDS ward. And after working there for a while, he began to think that his work there was futile, that it really wasn't having any impact, and all his patients died. And despite that, in his routine, he always prayed for all of his patients, and when they died, he would light a candle on the altar in his home and pray for them and their families. And so at the end of this story, he had a realization that maybe he wasn't there to cure people, but perhaps he was there so no one would die without someone to pray for them. And in that way, he was a blessing to his patients and their families. The next story that impacted me was the story of the Navajo priest who was giving a sermon that Rachel was listening to. And in trying to translate his sermon into English, he said, "Jesus is good medicine." And that was something that stuck with Rachel. And she said that sometimes just being in someone's presence is strong medicine. And I think that's something that going into our careers in healthcare is something that we can remember, that, you know, especially with our patients that are facing a really bad illness or are facing loss, or their family members are mourning for the loss of our patient and their family member, that just really being present with them and listening and just being wholly there for them and not just, you know, trying to check off a task on our list is something that a way that we can be a blessing to our patients and their family members. The next story that impacted me was a story of the Jungian dream analysts, and in response to the person who was having the recurring dreams about Nazis and tortures, they just silently acknowledged the dream, and they explained to the colleague who was confused about why they didn't have a discussion. They were talking about some things are just, you just need to acknowledge them and let the person who is experiencing whatever horrible thing like that, just to let them know that there's people there for them. So they mentioned so that no one has to suffer alone. And Rachel mentioned that perhaps a willingness to face such shared vulnerability gives us the capacity to repair the world. Those who find the courage to share a common humanity may find that they can bless anyone, anywhere. The next story that impacted me was the story of the Feely hearts that were sewn for the children who have experienced loss. And they mentioned that often children will give their hearts away to someone else they know that is experiencing loss. And Rachel mentioned that when we have the freedom to grieve, loss often turns naturally into compassion. And so I think, you know, everyone has experienced loss. I mean, definitely no one has ever experienced the same loss as someone else, or it always just feels different. But especially when you've experienced loss, it really had a profound impact on you. I think that we can be more compassionate for others who are experiencing loss, especially if it's similar to what we went through. And I think that's important, that when we're seeing our patients, so we can, that might be a way for us to really show compassion for our patients who are experiencing a big illness or just facing something tough, or the family members that are mourning the loss of their loved one. And lastly, I wanted to mention something from the movie Wit that we watched. And it was part of a poem by John Donne that the main character, Professor Baring, had studied a lot, and that her professor discussed with her, and it came up multiple times during the movie. And it was the fact that death is not the end of life, but just a pause, like her professor said, kind of like a comma, or the fine line between life and life everlasting. And I think that's something that really stuck with Professor Baring, and in that way her former professor had really provided a blessing in her life, especially towards the end when she wasn't doing well and was, you know, facing the forecoming of death. And maybe she didn't know that, and the professor even came to visit her at the end. And so her presence, because of what she had taught her, probably meant a lot to her in the end. All right, thanks.